While there are famous mediums who claim to be able to channel famous dead people, I'm having trouble channeling Daniel Natal. Watch me feebly try to do it here. In the wake of mob violence after the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict, I thought it might be good to delve into a brief history of mob violence. An early place to start would be in antiquity, under the reign of Justinian in the 6th century AD. In the book, Justinian's Flea by William Rosen, he recounts the Nicca riots. The pretext for the mob violence was a chariot race, where factions who backed rival teams started burning down the capital when their athlete lost. Back in the Byzantine Empire, they had political parties who grew out of this team allegiance, much like we have Republicans represented by the color red, and Democrats represented by the color blue. Well, back in the 6th century, they had the blues, the Veneti, and the greens, the Prasini. At any rate, when the violence erupted and mobs started burning down buildings and beating up random pedestrians, the Emperor Justinian wanted to get to the bottom of the violence, so he captured several rioters and asked them why they were rioting. To his astonishment, they said that they had been paid to riot. By whom? He asked. Eventually, the truth came out, that the riots had been staged and administered by a cabal of senators who wanted to remove Justinian from power. When Justinian found out about this, he executed the senators, and the violence stopped, like magic. He then seized their assets and used their money to repair the damages to the capital. By the way, the famous Hagia Sophia Church was one of the buildings torched by the rioters. This event is instructive to understand that when mob violence erupts, it's usually not spontaneous or organic. Oligarchs even back then used shiftless idiots to destabilize their society so that they could seize power. This brings us to the English Civil War in the 1600s. Charles I was murdered, and Oliver Cromwell took over England for a brief period to found the First British Republic. After Cromwell died, the monarchy was re-established in what is now called the Restoration. Charles II was put on the throne. But here's the thing. Most of the aristocrats who backed the murder of the first king were still in Parliament. They were the Whig Party, and even after the monarchy came back, these Whigs fought to undermine all monarchs who ascended to the throne. They worked to get rid of Charles II, and succeeded. Then they got rid of his successors. England had a long history of its aristocrats vying with the king for control of the land, so the aristocrats always favored weak monarchs. Eventually, they got a new dynasty installed that was German. George I from the German state of Hanover. George never bothered to learn English and spent most of his time concerned with his German holdings. The aristocrats back in England liked this because his disinterest allowed them to run England. George spent his entire life in Germany. His son, George II, never really learned English either and only showed up in England after the age of 40. He was also inattentive, and the aristocrats liked him as well. Problems only started when his son, George III, came along. Unlike his predecessors, he was born in England and actually spoke English. Disastrously, from the point of view of the Whigs, he actually tried to run the country. The Whigs in Parliament undermined him every chance they got. They even staged fake riots and paid radicals to cause civil disturbances to undermine him. One of the radicals whom the Whigs backed was John Wilkes, who ran a newspaper advocating for the removal of the king in the 45th issue of his newspaper. Because of this, 45 became a shibboleth by which anti-royalists would recognize each other in the street. They would flash it like a gang sign and hide it in different places. See here.
The object I want to draw our attention to here has a hidden number on it. It's a Worcester porcelain teapot made in the UK in 1760s. We look at the base of the spout and in tiny gold lettering we can just make out the number 45. It's actually the issue number for a magazine, issue number 45 of the North Briton. The North Briton was the publication of John Wilkes, a radical politician, and in issue 45 he wrote an editorial, a stinging rebuke of the King's speech to Parliament written by Lord Bute. As a result, Wilkes was arrested. Thereafter, the number 45 became a common refrain for sort of revolutionary activity with the mob. Mobs of Wilkites would go around Britain in the 1760s chanting Wilkes and liberty, Wilkes and liberty. Benjamin Franklin, the US polymath, was staying in London during that chaotic election, and he remarked on a trip to Winchester that every single door, without exception, was painted with the number 45. There's another story about the Austrian ambassador coming into London in a carriage and being stopped by the mob, who dragged him out and forced him to toast Wilkes and liberty. When he refused, they flipped him upside down and daubed the numbers 4 and 5 on the soles of his shoes.
Long story short, we Americans got our liberty because when King George tried to impose order in the American colonies, the oligarchs back in England undermined him at every step in Parliament. They didn't care a whit about us. Rather, this was due to their own infighting in England, their own power struggles. We could go down that rabbit hole and talk about the American Revolution, but the only reason I bring this up is because we see the oligarchs once again using mob violence to undermine the sitting leader of a country and to destabilize the land so that they could take over. Why were the oligarchs in Parliament so hateful of King George? Simple. He came in to get rid of the corruption and graft that had gone on steroids from the time of Oliver Cromwell. These aristocrats were draining the treasury and enriching themselves. George wanted to drain the swamp, as it were. Suffice it to say, they did everything they could to discredit him, and used the mass media of their day to do it. That's why, even today, you see movies with titles such as The Madness of King George, propaganda designed to make you think Orange Man bad. I mean, King George mad. At any rate, I just wanted to bring you a few examples of the use of mob violence so that you understand how power struggles work in politics and what happens when the Senate, or Parliament, decides to keep the gravy train going and to attack anyone who tries to stop them. So be mindful of the mass media telling you about the mobs disrupting certain cities across America, but remember what the media's real purpose is, what they see their job as, and who's pulling the strings. If you've gotten this far, you must be partial to our content. If you haven't already, head to thenewamerican.com and subscribe to our print magazine published twice a month and daily online. It's the essential news source for freedom-loving Americans. The New American Magazine is guided by our support of the U.S. Constitution and the principles upon which the Constitution is based. We want to restore and retain the values and vision that made America great: limited government under the Constitution, the freedoms our Constitution guarantees, and the personal responsibility a free people must exercise to stay free. To learn more, subscribe to our magazine. Visit thenewamerican.com.